Let me talk about The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle, published in 1901, which has a special interest for me because I am embarking on a project called the 1901 Project, which is reading stuff all around that era. That was the year of my grandfather's birth. So I'm using it as a kind of an excuse to kind of really dive into this area. And one of the first books I decided to read was The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is kind of a lot of fun. It's always surprising to me that, like, oh, Sherlock Holmes was actually published in the 19 some Sherlock Holmes was actually published in the 1900s. This is definitely a ways into Mr. Holmes's career. He has died. And The Hound of the Baskervilles is the first story that was written about Sherlock Holmes after he went over the Reichenbach Falls with Moriarty. Now, this in itself isn't the actual resurrection of Sherlock Holmes. This is a flashback story where Doyle has, like, it's like one of the further adventures before he died. He doesn't actually get officially resurrected until a little bit later. This was an interesting book for me. Cracking Sherlock Holmes novella. So there's that. But to me, I'm definitely looking at it through this 1901 lens. So yeah, the story, Dr. Mortimer comes to Sherlock Holmes with this problem. His friend Sir Charles Baskerville has died, and perhaps he's hasn't been. There's no mark saying that he's died, but he's worried that there's a family curse that the Hound of the Baskervilles, chases down the Baskerville family and leads to their doom. And so his friend has died, and the new heir, Henry Baskerville, is coming to town. And there is a reason to believe that he is also going to be in danger. So Holmes is like, oh, that's very interesting. Well, I've got stuff to do. I'll send Watson to check it out and report back to me. But I've got very important things to do. So, off with you. But Watson's a good man. He'll help. And so for a good hunk of this book, we get Watson. Of course, it's a Sherlock Holmes story, so Mr. Holmes is going to come back into the story. The things that stuck out to me going through the story is a lot of it actually centers on this Dr. Mortimer, who is kind of a comedic character who shows up at the beginning, kind of offends Sherlock Holmes. Is very obsessed with Holmes's skull. It's like, oh, I covet your skull. Could I give it a feel? And Holmes is like, no, no, you can't. And what this is phrenology, which is the pseudoscience where you involves the measurements of bumps on the skull to predict mental traits. Unfortunately, this is also pretty racist science. Purporting to say find differences between different racial types, and how different skulls will have the thing. There's a thing here of Sir Charles Baskerville when he was alive would they'd spend evenings with Dr. Mortimer and how he brought back scientific information from South Africa, where they spent many a charming evening we have spent together discussing the comparative anatomy of the Bushman and the Hottentot, which kind of gets into the racial side of thing. And this apparently is actually, while it's put in kind of the mouth of a comedic character, this is actually something that apparently Doyle was actually into, phrenology. Even though by this point at like 1901, when this is published, it was a fairly securely debunked science. It was not considered legitimate science. So there is this thing of the creator of the great scientific character had some pretty strange beliefs. There's also things in kind of spirituality and other stuff that Doyle was very much into. So it's like Sherlock Holmes was this logical character, the Spock, the Star Trek Spock of his age, but his creator was a little bit more kind of wibbly wobbly on his stuff. And as you go through the novel, this is very much a novel about inheritance of traits, of bad blood, things like that. There is a criminal on the moor, a career criminal, Selden, which, on this moor, which Watson goes through, and he's like, oh, I can almost envision all the kind of the savages who used to live here in huts, and kind of devolved humans. And when he and Henry Baskerville discover that this career criminal Selden is actually hiding on the moors. He's been actually been fed by the Baskervilles servants, the Barrymores, because actually it's the brother of one of the wife here. They go and find him, and it's kind of striking how he is described. They find him like because of a candle, and there's a candle that's been hidden in the rocks out of view of everything, and then it's over the rocks in the crevice which the candle burned. There was thrust out an evil yellow face, a terrible animal face, all seamed and scored with vile passions, foul with mire, with a bristling beard, and hung with matted hair. It might as well belong to one of those old savages who dwelt in the burrows on the hillside. The light beneath him was reflected in his small, cunning eyes, which pierced fiercely to right and left through the darkness, like a crafty and savage animal who has heard the steps of hunters. So, we're very much getting back into. There's this sort of thing of he was, his sister claims no, he was actually a good guy who fell in with the wrong guys and kind of went down a bad thing, and then the demon got in him, which is kind of the superstition thing. But there's also kind of this evolutionary thing of like he's more animal than man, that he's more descendant of the savages who used to tread these hills. And it does fall in line with a lot of the secrets that we learn throughout this thing, and a lot of them have to do with sort of bad blood, with who your parents were, and how that maybe turned that thus made you end up being also evil, as we find out maybe who the true villain in this piece is, and how inheritance very much goes to telling the story. Now, the other line that comes through here, which I thought was quite interesting, is that Dr. Mortimer at that very beginning, when he's talking to Sherlock Holmes and saying, I've come to see you," and he makes a point of saying that he decided that he'd go to Holmes because he felt he was the second highest expert in Europe. And it's like Holmes is like, "Oh yeah, who's the first?" And he says Bertillon. And it's a very just quick thing, and we kind of pass over it. But Alphonse Bertillon, 1853 to 1914, was a French police officer and biometrics researcher. He created sort of the ID system based on physical measurements, which they sort of used to try and identify criminals. And this was eventually supplanted by fingerprints, which actually may have also originated from an idea from Bertillon. He's the inventor of mugshot, created many other kind of forensic things, ways to preserve footprints, ballistics, other stuff like that. But he is also notable for being a witness in the Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfus affair being this prosecution of a Jewish French officer who was accused of passing secrets to the Germans. And this erupted into a giant scandal, where he was convicted, but quickly it became pretty apparent that no, he wasn't. And they actually found they found the actual guy who did do it, but quickly kind of swept that under rug, exonerated him, and just kept on going after him. This was like the trials and imprisonments stretched from like 1894 to 1906. He was sent to Devil's Island, the famous colony, the penal prison for the worst of the worst for the French system. And all of this all this conviction seemed to hang on a document that was found in a garbage can. And Bertillon, who was not a handwriting expert, testified at the trial as a handwriting expert that Dreyfus had actually written this thing, that he had somehow disguised his. It's all very convoluted. It turns out to be utter bullshit. It's utter bullshit that what was done. And indeed, his evidence was sort of thoroughly, finally, kind of completely debunked, and Dreyfus was exonerated for this crimes finally in 1906. I think finally getting completely off, ending up getting back into the army. But it's like it's interesting that that is the fellow that gets put forward as the highest expert that Dr. Mortimer has to say. And it's like it's one of these things of like, is this along with phrenology something that Doyle actually believed? It's just interesting that you would have an expert, even if he didn't believe it. It's interesting that you have an expert, someone who is highly revered, especially maybe at the time that this story is set, but then later has been has. I don't know if he's completely debunked by 1901. By 1906, you would think he would be quite debunked as an expert in matters like this. But it's interesting that that is the figure that gets put up, which, it kind of comes to the whole thing of the scientific, logical detective. I mean, a lot of Sherlock Holmes's methods, how much of it is, it's all really entertaining and it's all a really good story, but it's also like, how much of this is real? How much of this should we believe? How much of this is fantasy? How much of actual scientific police scientific evidence should we believe? How much of it can we hold on to even today? A lot of times where someone will, we unfortunately have cases of experts firmly declaring, of course this is true, and then it getting debunked later. And it's interesting in the scientific detective Sherlock Holmes, which you could say is kind of the popularization, the start of like forensics, of having this kind of authority to tell what happened in a judicial setting. We have the phrenology, and we have a figure like Alphonse Bertillon kind of evoked in this famous detective, the great detective story. Now, I know from at the very end of the story where Holmes invites Watson to go see de Rezix as Raoul in Les Huguenots at the Royal Opera, that this story is set somewhere between, at least the end of the story is set somewhere between May and June 1893. I looked it up. That is when that actual singer performed in Les Huguenots in London. So the Dreyfus affair starts in 1894. So it's a year later. So at this point in the story, as the characters know, as Dr. Mortimer knows, they know this about Dr. Bertillon, that he is the expert. But it's published in 1901, where Bertillon, whose name I would assume would become to much more prominence in an international setting with the Dreyfus affair, which was really well known, is now very prominent as somebody who's convicted Dreyfus. So that's just that interesting thing of like, oh, okay, where we are in history, what we are evoking, like trying to figure out what we're trying to evoke with Bertillon out of the mouth of this character who is somewhat comedic, but also who and offends Sherlock Holmes. So like, he's not the greatest guy in this story. He's the bumbling twerp that you have at the beginning of the story to sends the problem to Sherlock Holmes, who decides whether or not it's interesting or not. But we've got the kind of evocation of pseudoscience and of an expert who isn't that great of an expert at all, who definitely seems to be a kind of one of these founders of modern forensics, but also kind of illustrates the kind of example of how experts can start thinking that they're experts in lots of things, and using somebody's status as authority to convict someone when they actually don't have the actual proper knowledge, and they've been just used to manipulate to snow somebody under in a conviction. So yeah, I just thought that was all interesting stuff that I got out of The Hound of the Baskervilles, which is a cool atmospheric, on the moors. Very much I think about Arthur Machen and stuff like that. There's House on the Hill or something like that. There's these stories of like, ancient times running kind of like this kind of dark river running through the history of Britain, and kind of it's not a good thing. It's kind of a dark foreboding. It's kind of, we're also getting Freud in this time, and the dark id coming through. There's this disquiet which I enjoy in the stories, but is also kind of it's kind of a modern thing in a way. This disquiet that we get maybe from going forward into the 20th century here. This, which is 1901, 20th century. All right, I will leave it there. More videos later.